Hey everybody, welcome to episode 3 of my broken collarbone recovery diary. If you want to skip the verbal introduction, there's a timestamp in the description. You can click on that and go straight past this. If you haven't seen episode 1, that was shot one day after the accident, and it was basically me telling you about my clavicle break, what kind of fracture it was, and what other injuries I experienced when I came off my bike. Episode 2 was shot a fortnight after the accident, and that was me exploring in detail some of the ways the broken collarbone has affected my lifestyle. And then I went on to show you guys joint movements. Joint movements are a very simple series of movements that we do with the major joints in the body, from the toes all the way up to the head. It's something that I've been doing every day since my accident, and I class it as the start of my yoga practice. I've completely changed my yoga practice since I broke my collarbone. And so today, episode 3, I'm shooting 4 weeks after the accident. It's now a month. And I'm going to show you the rest of my practice. So I've been adapting it, modifying it, trying to keep things as soft as possible, making sure I'm not aggravating the injury and aggravating a lot of these ribs down here, which were also hurt in the accident. So this is like an extension of episode 2. So if you haven't seen episode 2, jump back, go give that a watch. This is what I do after joint movements. One thing I will say is this is my experience. Everybody's journey will be different in this kind of situation. Stick to the advice of your doctors and your physiotherapists. I'm just showing you guys how I've adapted and modified my yoga practice around my injury. I should also add that my dog Moopy appears in this video. He decided to sunbathe during the practice as I was shooting it, and I didn't have the heart to move him. So yeah, hopefully you don't find it too distracting. Straight after the joint movements we explored in episode 2, I would take a shoulder width stance, clasp my hands over my stomach, and with an exhale, fold forward from the waist, trying to keep as much length in the spine as possible. After maybe 4 or 5 days, I was able to bring my left hand just to rest gently on the floor, making sure I wasn't compressing my sore ribs too much. And I'd say after maybe 2 or 2.5 weeks, I was bringing my right arm to the ground, touching the ground ever so slightly. Now that I'm at the 4-week mark, I can clasp the toes in the traditional posture, Dandasana, but I'll underline that this was something I really built up to, being very careful not to squash the abdomen too much, which was hurting the ribs. To begin with, I was probably folding 10 degrees, not much more than that, all the while making sure I wasn't letting my shoulders fall down towards the ground, but rather keeping them opened up and pulling away from the floor. Stepping out to a wide stance, with the feet parallel, legs straight, hands clasping the stomach to begin with, I would do side stretches, opening out the intercostal muscles between the ribs. Eventually, I'd say after about 5 days, I brought my left arm into the equation, exhaling, dropping down, inhaling back up to the center line, exhaling, dropping down, inhaling back to center. Now that I'm 4 weeks into recovery, I am able to include my right arm in this movement, but to begin with, I just left it clasping the stomach, as breathing was painful, the right side of my body was sore, and my ribs were really hurting, so really to begin with I was doing 5 or 10 degrees bending to the left and the right, and not much more than that. Now moving on to spinal twisting. Ordinarily I would focus on trying to keep the hips squared forward and not travelling around with the torso like they are in this video, but in all honesty this was quite strong in the ribs to begin with, and so I just gave up on that. I let my hips follow the body as they needed to, and I didn't try and force as much movement through the abdomen as perhaps I would normally expect. You can see I brought my left arm up. This was after maybe a week. This is the good arm. I kept the right arm holding onto the stomach. It felt a bit odd doing it one-handed. Now that I'm a month in, I can bring the right arm up into the posture, and I can exhale, twist, throw the right arm out behind me, and I'm trying to make sure the arms aren't dropping down towards the floor as I pass through this movement, keeping them on an even plane the whole way around. Keeping that wide stance with the feet still parallel, I would then fold forward at the waist. First few days, maybe 10 degrees, building up over the course of about a week to this 90 degrees posture you see, and eventually getting my left hand to touch the floor lightly. I would start twisting. I would inhale to the floor, exhale, twist to the side. Inhale to the floor, twist to the side, keeping my right arm against the stomach. You can see my left hand lifting up away from the ground, and as the days progressed, I started bringing both hands to the floor, and again, once I hit the 4-week mark, I was able to actually bring my right hand up towards the ceiling, and balancing out, I'd bring my left hand up to the ceiling. To begin with, this didn't look anything like you're seeing on the screen. I was mainly keeping my hands on the stomach and just moving at the waist. This movement was very slight to begin with. The back of my body was so tight from sleeping sitting upright, and from the accident I was tight through the lower back and the glutes, so I wasn't actually looking up to the ceiling, I was keeping my eyes on the floor. From this breathing exercise I transitioned into Ekapada Prasaranasana, the front leg at 90 degrees with the knee above the ankle, the back leg stretched out behind, opening up the hip flexor. I started off with my hands clasped over the stomach. I didn't have them on the waist like you can see in the image. Eventually I worked towards bringing them onto the quadricep after maybe a week, and it was okay bringing the left hand to the floor into the fingertips, but it did create a bit of compression between the body and the leg, which was sore on all the ribs that I'd injured. And I did notice that bringing the right hand to the ground, as you can now see, created compression between the broken ends of the bone, so that's something I haven't explored so much, and I don't spend a lot of time there at the moment. It's something I'm building up more now, 4 weeks in, but at the start I left it alone. On the left side, it's much the same. Again, the front knee is above the ankle, working towards bringing a hand to the ground, but trying to keep space between the body and the leg so there's not too much pain in the ribs. I can now get that right hand to the floor, but it's not something I was doing to begin with. To begin with, just clasping the stomach in that invisible sling position, focusing on breathing and opening out the hip flexor primarily. Taking my knees to shoulder width apart, I then entered into a one-handed version of tiger breathing. With my hand in the midline, you can see that left hand on the ground, that's actually in line with the crotch. You might not be able to tell from the angle. It's halfway between the knees. Felt a bit odd doing it one-handed. I'm inhaling and looking up to the ceiling, and exhaling, arching the back. When I did bring the right hand to the floor, I kept the hand close to the knee. This kept the angle between the shoulder and the body quite small, and this felt good for the first few weeks. Still inhaling, looking up to the ceiling, exhaling, arching the back in towards the navel. This did feel strong, especially with the exhale. I felt a lot of movement through the ribs, which was a bit uncomfortable, so it was something I did in quite a shallow manner for the first, I'd say, 3 weeks. Eventually I moved my hands to an equal place. You can see I've taken my right hand forward away from the knee, with the shoulders stacked above the elbows stacked above the wrists, trying not to dump too much weight through the shoulder, keeping mindful of how I'm moving, making sure I'm not creating too much motion in the broken clavicle itself. Carrying on seated postures, I would actually use a block, which is kind of unusual for me, and I'll show you why now. Without a block sitting on the floor, any folding forward, the arm presses into the leg and it created an uncomfortable feeling in my shoulder. By sitting on the block, this opened up the angle between the body and the legs, which gave me more space for forward folding. I began with just a gentle kind of pumping motion, exhale forward, inhale back up. After about 4 days, I would bring my left hand to hold onto the shin and just hold this posture for a while. And then maybe after another week, I was bringing my right hand lightly to the floor, and then eventually to hold onto the shin as well. I resisted the urge to go straight for the toes, as I felt like this was causing my shoulders to roll in, so when I did grab onto my toes, it was just with the left hand for the first 4 weeks. Eventually, I let myself hold on with my right hand, and this is something I am exploring just now, but I would say there's a sense of the shoulder rolling forward and closing in, which feels uncomfortable in the broken bones, so it's not something I hold for very long at all. I then moved on to Janu Sirsasana. You can see I've started out with just some light pumping forward and backwards. The right knee is closed, the sole of the foot is pressed against the inside of the left thigh. Hand is in invisible sling motion, and my left hand's holding onto the toes. After a while I felt able to take that right hand to the floor, and then eventually I would actually take that hand out ahead of the knee. You will see this more clearly on the left hand side of the posture, which is just coming up. I was avoiding holding onto the toes with both hands for similar reasons as the previous posture. It felt like it was causing the shoulders to roll in, and so for just now I've been doing Janu Sirsasana with one hand. Switching onto the other side, you can see more clearly what the leg is doing. I'm keeping that hand in the invisible sling motion that we discussed in episode 2. Beginning with just holding onto the shin, working up to taking the hand all the way to the toes. It felt a bit odd doing this one-handed on this side. It feels like the right hand should be the one doing all the work when you're coming down the right leg. But I resisted the urge to involve it, keeping it in the invisible sling motion, or if I felt like it, taking it to the floor, building up to taking it out, maybe just beyond the knee, focusing on folding on the waist, keeping as much length in the spine as possible, working towards bringing that forward down to the knee. but moving softly and slowly. I then took both legs out wide for Upavistha Konasana, wide angle pose. Again, I would clasp the hands over the stomach and I would pump lightly backward and forward, maybe 5-10 degrees. After a while I was able to take my hands to the floor ahead of the legs, and I also played with taking them behind. The nice thing about taking the hand behind was it felt like it was opening out the shoulder a little more. I'm now taking the hands to the shins, not grabbing onto the toes yet as it still feels like it might be rolling my shoulder in a little bit, which is hurting the clavicle, but this has been a really nice posture for me, especially in the first few weeks when I had this really sore back from wearing slings and from struggling to walk about straight and from sleeping in the sitting upright positions. The next part of my practice feels a little more experimental than the rest because I've actually been using a yoga wheel which I was given as a gift. For the last 4 weeks it's been invaluable. To begin with, I had it pressed against the upper back in between my shoulder blades and I would drop my head backward to touch it. Over the first few days my head didn't get anywhere near it. It took maybe 5 days for the crown of my head to actually touch the edge of the wheel, which you can't really see, but that's what's happening just now. And that was wonderful for opening out my neck, but also opening up the upper back a little bit. The fact that the wheel fit in between my shoulder blades meant that my shoulders were able to open up as well, which felt great. I then moved on to just using it as a bit of a roller, so having let my head drop back, I would just roll along the wheel, not really using any kind of back bending, but just letting it massage the muscles that were so tight along the spine. And then after perhaps 2 weeks, I started turning this into a bit more of a back bend, where I'd actually bring the crown of the head down towards the floor. You can see I roll back and the crown of the head is touching the ground. This was actually very strong. I hurt myself here in week 2, I hurt my ribs. So of the whole practice, this is perhaps the one area I should have slowed things down on, being a little less keen to experiment and being a little more patient, taking a little more time. I would then reset the wheel, lower down my back and drop my head back one last time just to open out that neck again, and I think the first day or 2 this was my Shavasana. Once I'd finished with the wheel, I'd roll it away and move into Setu Bandhasana breathing, planting the feet, knees straight up in the air, feet about shoulder width apart, inhaling lifting the hips, exhaling lowering down, moving with the breath and making sure I was really trying to feel the vertebrae unroll along the floor one by one in each direction. This wasn't a posture I was doing for the first week. Lying on the ground with my shoulders touching the floor just felt really awkward and uncomfortable, but once I was able to comfortably do it, it was really nice at opening up that tight back I had from the sling and sleeping upright. You can see here I'd finish off with just a hold, holding it for 5 breaths or so before lowering down, one vertebrae at a time. Finally, Shavasana, using a block initially to support the head as lying flat on the floor was just unbearable to begin with. Truthfully, I didn't take Shavasana lying down for the first 4 or 5 days, I actually took it sitting upright. The block was there to support my head when I was able to lie on the floor. After about a week, I could do without it and I'd just lay flat on the ground and I'd spend 10% of my practice here, so probably 3 or 4 minutes listening to the breath and coming back to how my body felt, enjoying that moment of peace. Eyes closed, feet dropping out to either side, palms up to the ceiling. Finally, I'd come up to a sitting position and I'd sit here with my hands clasped over my stomach with the eyes shut. After a week I would take my left hand to the knee, my right hand staying on the stomach. Eventually I could bring the fingertips just to rest on the floor. And currently I'm actually bringing that right hand to the knee itself. And I sit in some kind of variation of Padmasana, lifting the crown of the head towards the ceiling, elongating the spine, making sure I'm rolling the shoulders back, which is now more important than ever. Finishing off my practice before I move on with the rest of my day. So thanks very much for watching episode 3. This was an exploration of some of the simple asana I've been employing in my practice since my injury, which is about 4 weeks ago now. And just one more time I'll reiterate, these are what I was doing straight after joint movements. So every day I've been doing the joint movements from episode 2, and then after that I've been following it up with the postures you've seen today to build back my strength, my flexibility, and my physical well-being. Thanks very much. Catch you next time.